Welcome to Nature's Guardians. I'm Micah. Each week, I talk with people working to save and help animals around the world. They are nature's guardians, and you can become one too. Today, I'm talking with Jim Steele in California. Welcome to the show, Jim.
Thanks for having me, Micah.
To start, tell me about your background and how you got where you are now.
I'm an ecologist, and I got hired back in the 80s to be the director of a field station in the Sierra Nevada field campus, run by San Francisco State University. I was in charge of developing environmental education programs, plus I was doing research on birds and some of the wet meadows out there, and some of that research led to a whole restoration of a watershed. And partly as an ecologist, I have to look at everything.
I really want to talk to you today about mass extinction, so I brought this paper. I wrote my questions down, so I'm going to be reading them. So, according to the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, more than 1 million species, especially insects, are now threatened with extinction, vanishing at rates not seen in 10 million years. What do you think?
That's a little of that data is shaky, it's speculation, but I do agree that we've had a lot more extinctions because of loss of habitat. And so they can extrapolate and say, oh, we should see so many insects. A lot of who he's saying is gone extinct or a species hasn't even identified yet. So it needs to be looked at a little more in depth, but that's what people are pushing right now. People are pushing a crisis.
Why are they pushing a crisis?
I think there's different reasons for that. You know, it's politically powerful. You play on people's empathy. You know, I don't think any of us want to see mass extinctions. We want to kind of protect the environment from that happening. But then everybody shows their own solution. You know, vote for me, send donations. Sometimes people are just scared. Some people really don't know. They're just repeating what somebody else has said.
According to the paper, it says here that there have been 5 mass extinctions. What is a mass extinction? How many have there been? And what can you tell us about them?
Through the fossil record, they kind of look at what's a background extinction rate. And you see it's labeled the 5 big mass extinctions. This one here is the one with the Cretaceous, when we had an asteroid or a bolide, whatever they want to call it, hit in the Gulf of Mexico, threw up a lot of dust, and they think that caused everything to die. The Cretaceous one was about 65 million years ago. This first mass extinction, before there was life on land, was about 440 million years ago. And the big one they talk about is the Permian, and that happened about 250 million years ago. But there's a lot of debate. If you see, these triangles are showing where when it goes up, new species are being formed, and when it goes down, species are being extinct. And the other thing is, if you look at this, these are how many genera we see since that last big extinction. In the recent times, the last 60 million years, we've had more and more genera evolve. And partly that's because, do you know what I mean when I say Pangea? All the continents were combined into one?
Yeah.
There was very little habitat, but now as the continents spread apart, you have a lot more different habitat. So if I'll go up to this slide, here's what happened in 2 different, we had more species form on these volcanic islands. There were nothing on the volcanic islands to hunt these birds. The birds got there, so this one species was the ancestor. It arrived, and we figure about 5 million years ago, and it formed, they think, almost 100 species. A lot of them have gone extinct, but we still have these 17 that have formed. And so when you have new habitat, you can have new species. But the problem with being on an island, if you introduce a predator, or you come onto that island with a disease, which has happened here, we brought mosquitoes in. That brought in avian malaria, which has killed a lot of the birds in Hawaii. We brought in rats, and that fed on a lot of these birds. they had sugar canes, and that the rats were getting the sugar canes, so they brought in mongoose, and then the mongoose started eating the birds too, so it was a problem. And we see something similar here. Is if you heard the Galapagos Islands, they're off of Peru.
Yeah, I've been there. It's awesome.
It's awesome. And that what gave all these people ideas about evolution, because they could see all these birds were related to some ancestor. So when you see these histories of more species forming, it's often because there's open niches, there's less competition. And so as continents spread apart, as we had more islands, we had more species form. Well, let me scroll down to Madagascar. I know you were interested in Madagascar, where they have a lot of extinctions right now. Well, Madagascar separated from Africa during the age of dinosaurs, about 200 million years ago. And so some of the species that already evolved were here. Monkeys and apes had not evolved yet. So if you look at this as sort of the evolutionary cycle, lemurs started to evolve here, and they were all over, but because they were on Madagascar, they were saved from other competitions. So while the lemurs died out all around the world, as monkeys were better competitors, the lemurs, the only place they had a refuge was here in Madagascar. Because this was an island, people didn't get to it until about 2,000 years ago. And once they got here, all these lemurs, a lot of them, they were hunting for food, what they call bushmeat. People were poor, so they would try to make farmland, so they would cut the trees and burn, what we call slash and burn agriculture. So that would remove some of the habitat. So they think probably most of these lemurs are really in dire straits because we're losing a lot of habitat because people have been chopping down their forests, introducing predators, et cetera, et cetera. The zoos like to go for these lemurs. And the other thing that happens in these islands is a lot of times the birds get there, and because they have no predators, they don't have to fly. And if some fly away, the ones that don't fly away often have very small wings. I don't know if you've seen pictures of dodo birds before.
Yes.
You see how tiny the wings are. So a lot of the birds that survived in Madagascar became flightless. And so when people came, if they brought new predators, they went extinct for that reason. Madagascar had the biggest, it probably was related to the ostrich. It was called the elephant bird. And so here's the size of a person, here's the size of an elephant bird. But when people got there, they had gigantic eggs, which was nice eating. There were lots of food, and eventually the people wiped them out. So they went extinct maybe couple hundred years ago due to people coming and overhunting. So the two big problems with our extinction rates now is you take away the habitat, you overhunt for food, and you bring in diseases and competitors. Three things, I should say. And it's a little different if I go to Borneo is a big issue right now. And Borneo is an island now, but it wasn't 10,000 years ago. If you look, all this brown spot, when you had all the glaciers 10,000 years ago, the sea level fell about 400 feet. So this was all one big land. So unlike Madagascar, just had like birds and lemurs, Borneo has rhinoceros, it has orangutans, it has tigers, and many, all these are being a sort of threatened with extinction right now. If you can see, there's really three subspecies of orangutans, and as the water rose, Borneo became separated from Sumatra, this whole area, and so you got a little bit of evolution of subspecies where they look a little different, they act a little different. But orangutans are mostly live in the trees, and so one of the biggest things that's hurting them is the cutting down of the rainforest that's been going on the last maybe 100 years. And the biggest thing right now is they've been planting palm oils. And the palm oil in the last 50 years has just been spreading and spreading and taking away a ton of what their habitat is. Years ago, people didn't come into Borneo that much because it was mostly swamps around the edges. But now, because the palm oil is good, the trees are very valuable for lumber, They've been cutting up Borneo left and right and threatening a lot of species. You have another one like rhinos, that you have rhinos from all around the world, but the Borneo, the one that's in Borneo was a hairy one. It seems to be related to what was the woolly one in the Pleistocene. So, but it's kind of now limited to the forest, where most of the other rhinos in Africa, like the grasslands. So as you chop up the forest, these guys are having their problems. So those are the kind of two big extinctions, but there's a few others there. But if you summarize this, the whole thing is that if you lose habitat, you're gonna lose species. As you lose habitat, you're gonna lose a lot more insects, and that's what they're guessing is there's millions going extinct, even though they don't know that for sure. But by the loss of habitat, that's what they argue. Here's a picture of what I call the intertropical convergence zone. Have you heard of that before?
No, but it sounds cool.
Well, what it is you have the trade winds take all this water vapor from the south of the equator or north of the equator, and it converges, which is why they call it a convergence zone. And then it rises and it causes all this rainfall. So here's the idea. The trade winds bring this in, and all this water comes together, and as it rises, it cools and it falls. And so wherever this intertropical convergence zone is where you get these heavy rainforests, because you get a ton of water. Now that air rises and falls to the north and south, but that air is dry. It lost all its rain here. So where this comes down is where you get desert. You can see where Borneo is. In January, all the rain happens over here. When it moves to our summer, then they get a dry period while you get all these monsoons and wet period there. Madagascar is a little different. It only comes down about halfway. So the north side of Madagascar is a lot of tropical rainforest, and the southern part is pretty dry habitat. So it gets a little more affected by changes in the climate. 6,000 years ago, this tended to stay further north, and the Sahara Desert was grassland. It had tons of animals, lakes, grasses, people living there. And then about 6,000 years ago, it's because of the way the axis of the Earth tilts, the ITCC moved south and caused this whole thing to turn into a desert. So you have climate affecting animals as time goes on, and over a million years period, our glaciations happen every 100,000, 120,000. So you go from very cold to very wet. You change where the rainforests are going to be affected by more or less water. So when they say it's the highest extinction rate in millions of years, I'm not sure if I quite buy that, but again, it is a little higher than what the background rates that we know from fossils because of what we're doing into the environment.
Wait. According to the paper, more than 500 species are on the brink of extinction, which they say means that there are less than 1,000 individuals of that species. Help me understand that.
If you lose enough habitat, if you overhunt and populations get so small, then they become at a greater risk for extinction. And that's what they're referring to. And it doesn't always happen. I'll give you an example, was the Aleutian goose up in Alaska. People thought they had gone extinct because people put foxes on these islands that they bred on for fur farms because they wanted the fur. But the foxes ate all the geese. And they thought they had disappeared, but then they found probably it was less than 50. I think it was even less than 20 on one island. So they realized what they were doing. They started removing as many foxes as they could from different islands so they could have more islands to breed on. And now the Aleutian goose, there's just a ton of them. They're related to the Canada goose that you would see back east. But now when they come down to Oregon and California and places, there's so many of them, people think they're a pest. They want to get rid of them. So some of these species, even though they get down to that small, do have the potential to come back. So it just depends the genetic makeup of whatever that species is. Some can adapt and make more species, others just can't, and when things change, they die out.
According to the recent UN report on biodiversity and ecosystem services, estimates that a quarter of all species face extinction?
The person that was a co-author on the paper you showed was Paul Ehrlich. And he thought, because of the population bomb, which is a book that he wrote, that like New York would be wiped out, half of the world would be wiped out. He just a tremendous amount of fearful predictions and projections that he made that have not even come close to being true. He didn't realize people could do better agriculture, be more efficient. So his predictions, and a lot of like what you just read with the UN, is based on certain scientists that just have this catastrophic view of life. But there's a lot of other people that push back on that they don't get the media attention, because the media likes clickbait. You know, if you say everything's the same, then you probably won't read the story. If they say we're all gonna die, that's gonna get your attention.
I've been to the Amazon rainforest. Are you concerned about the species there?
The craziness of this is these biofuels like palm oil or corn here or sugarcane in Brazil is being pushed as a way to save the environment. But as people try to make these things, they're tearing down the environment. So the rainforest hasn't disappeared as much as sometimes people push. It's definitely lost a small amount as people have moved into it.
What about wildfires? Do they kill a lot of animals?
Oh, absolutely. You know, if I go back to Borneo, they've started to experience a number of fires. When you have very dry years, it's easier to have a big fire. But when you have a tropical rainforest, usually it's damp enough not to have big fires. But people have been setting fires on purpose to get rid of the trees so they can plant stuff. You know, they call them slash and burn agriculture. Other places outside the rainforest have periodic fires, which the plants are often adapted to. They have cones that only open up when a fire goes by, and then they spread their seeds then. But if you look at the data, say for North America, 80–90% of the fires are started by humans. The other thing is, if we suppress fires for 100 years, and so that allowed all this scrub to grow up, and grasses and bushes and whatever that are easily ignitable. You can't really light a tree on fire that easy. If you ever built a campfire and try to hold a match under a log, it's just not going to work. You use paper or grass or leaves, and then you put little small sticks and then bigger sticks. But when we suppress fires, we allow all those small things to build up, which then can ignite the trees. And when that happens, you can have some pretty big fires.
What's ocean acidification?
Ocean acidification. To me, there's a lot of hype on this ocean acidification, depending on what's going on. If you add CO2 to the water, it will briefly make it a little more acidic. It will lower the pH. But by adding CO2, you create more phytoplankton blooms. And when the phytoplankton use that CO2 for photosynthesis, then the pH goes back up. And so you can see sometimes on these reefs, the pH bounces between 7 and 9 in just over a period of a day.
So you're saying that ocean acidification is not a bad thing?
Yes. Yeah, but what I'm saying is it's so variable during the course of the day, just the course of seasons, in that many of these marine organisms have adapted to it. And when you just go from 8.2 to 8.1, from what they're guessing is an average, that does not look like it's a real problem. And when you add CO2 to the environment, whether it's on land or in the ocean, you're increasing photosynthesis, because all these plants, they actually do a lot better when there's 1,000 parts per millimeter CO2 than what we have now at 400. Plants we could double it and plants would be happy.
So if I understand you correctly, your main concern here is loss of habitat.
Absolutely. I think that is the biggest issue. And partly as human population went from like 1 billion to 8 billion people over the last 100 years, you're taking down more habitat.
Yeah, that's my 30 years question. Okay, now, I have it here. Stop talking. What do you predict for the next 30 years for ecosystems?
And that's a tough one to assess. It depends where you're looking. In the East, like Vermont was, say, 80% deforested in 1900. And that's because people had these marginal farms. As we've been more efficient with our agriculture, those marginal farms were abandoned and they went back to nature. And now Vermont is like 80% forested again. Animals like moose have increased, and they've actually increased so much they've moved from, I used to go to Maine to see moose. Well, now they're down in Massachusetts and Connecticut, where they had never been there when I was growing up. So in those kind of places, those ecosystems are coming back better. Grasslands, I think, in the United States are a little more struggle because they're good places for agriculture to take over. So it's kind of, in some ways, grasslands were going back to normal, but people started pushing corn for biofuels. What I think they're really doing is by planting more palm oil in Borneo, more sugarcane in Brazil, more corn in the United States Great Plains, you're taking away habitat that could go back to nature and allow a more robust and more resilient ecosystem.
Because of cultivated meat and other innovations, maybe we'll have less farmland in the next 30 years.
It's possible. The idea of cultured meat doesn't quite sit right with me at this point in time, but it's possible. I think any time we can be more efficient with the plants that we eat and the meat that we eat, so we're taking less from the land, the better off we'll be. Whether this cultured meat will work or not, it remains to be seen.
There's going to be another billion people in the next 30 years. So how do you think that's going to impact ecosystems?
Depends how we adapt to it. What we also see is we see a lot more people move into the city. So some of that population will be taken up in the cities. It depends on how efficient our agriculture is and how our animal husbandry is, so we can have enough food. And that was one of the reasons from that paper that Paul Ehrlich was saying, the population bomb. He didn't think we could feed people by the year 2000. He thought we'd all be starving to death. But we have become more efficient. So we just don't know, but I don't doubt that people will figure out ways to do it. I worry more about people trying to use biofuels. That seems to be what's taking away a lot of the land right now than any other issue. So, I don't think in the overall scheme of extinctions or whatever, kids should worry about that happening. I do feel that kids are being scared way more than they should be. It's making kids think that, that life is going to go extinct in the next 30 years. And again, I think that's fear mongering for political reasons, not for reality. As an ecologist, I spent 30 years in the Sierra Nevada, and I told you that the 49ers ripped it up. They cut down every tree. The hills were bare. They took the rivers and put them in boxes so they could mine the gravel at the bottom of the stream. So they changed all this, but that whole area has come back. The trees are all back. And some people think there's too many trees now because of fire danger. We've had wolves come back down to that area. We had a wolverine out behind us. What made that whole environment that I was in suffer was because people screwed up the habitat. They cut down all the trees. They rearranged the rivers. Kids who are really concerned about trying to restore habitat, become an ecologist, become a habitat restoration person. That would be a great profession. And that's basically that's what I thought I did. I had a love for nature. I became an ecologist and got to do what I had to do. It was a small piece, one watershed, but everyone does their small part.
Thank you, Jim.
Well, thank you for having me. It's good to see young people like yourself really interested in finding out what's going on.
And thank you for watching. You can help animals by hitting the like button and subscribing to this channel. I'll see you next time on Nature's Guardians. Bye.